The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he can't believe it exists.
The law is whatever the powers that be in power happen to say it is today. Whatever they say it is, that's what the law is today. And it may change tomorrow.
As people started to live together in societies, there was nothing to prevent individuals from infringing upon the rights and freedoms of each other. Once that happened, there were only two choices: either protect ourselves or elect a group of individuals to protect our rights for us. We chose the latter, and thus law was born to protect our rights and freedoms.
We have no law in America. And understand that. There's a Roman maximum in law that says, "For he that would be deceived, let him." Simply meaning, if you are so ignorant as to be deceived, then that's your business. That's your problem. So you need to do your homework and find out what the words mean, especially in relation to law and government. Because there is a world of occultism that is operating today throughout the world, in which you use certain words, and when those words are used in a court, they don't mean the same thing at all.
Jordan Maxwell speaks about words. Words are definitely his forte. He also speaks about where words come from.
Understanding law and the words of law, there are two things that this planet has: water and earth, water and land. Consequently, there are two kinds of law: the law of the land and the law of water. You've heard the term law of the land, but in point of fact, that's precisely what this word means, law of the land, because it is the people who live on land. And that is opposed to something else called the law of the high seas, or the law of water. You need to understand the difference. The law of the land is the law of the culture that lives on the land. And so consequently, the law of the land is different in every country. You can do things in America you can't do in Russia. You can do things in Africa you can't do in England. So the law of the land is the law of the culture that lives on that particular land. However, there is a higher law that dominates the entire world. It's called the law of the water, or the law of the high seas. The law of water is referred to as the law of money. It doesn't matter what color you are, where you're from, or where you live. Money is money. And any time you're doing banking or using money, you are now under the law of water, maritime admiralty.
In the film, The Occult World of Commerce, Jordan Maxwell and Jason Whitney give a great overview explaining in depth the important differences between the two law systems, how they were merged, and how this affects how we live today. Countries' laws end at the borders of their land. It's also known as common law, the law of the common people. The proper English common law was originally based on the Ten Commandments section of the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, but it's also considered to be common sense law. The common law that's developed over time has but one purpose. That sole purpose is to protect our fundamental rights and freedoms of life, liberty, and property. The purpose of law was never to restrict or destroy our rights and freedoms. Its sole purpose, then and now, is for the preservation and protection of these gifts.
There are two different kinds of law. There is civil law, which is the law of the land, and there is UCC, which is maritime law. UCC stands for Uniformed Commercial Code, which was created thousands of years ago by the Phoenician Canaanites.
Marine law, or the law of water, is the law of money, or currency. It is the law that governs all money in the world, and is the same type of law in every country with a central bank. It is also known as commercial law, covering all forms of commerce. You may not have heard of the Uniform Commercial Code, or the UCC, but it is the foundation of how all modern financial transactions are handled. And while very complex, understanding it gives a great insight as to how the banking game is played.
The entities who created the system understood that they could not control you, the flesh and blood you, but if they turned you into a corporation under the UCC law, then they would effectively be able to have that control.
Because the government created a situation when we're in perpetual debt, but that is unlawful. So they also gave us a remedy, a solution to fix it, but they hid it from us.
Whenever we're dealing in a business, then all countries and all corporations work under UCC.
Throughout history, law has been corrupted and used in many ways it was never intended to be used. Laws have also been created to control and enslave people for the sole benefit of those in power. Before the implementation of marine law, which was layered to exist over our already existing common law, in the United States of America, people were called sovereigns. That is, you were your own country. You were considered a soul, created by God, and you were born and owned your own body. Instead of a first and a last name, like you have today, you had what was called a Christian and family name. Not only did you own your own body, but you were completely responsible for it. You could use any substance you wished to your own benefit or peril. If two men consented to having a gunfight in the streets, to the death, it was their right as long as it was consensual. The sheriff would stand by to make sure no innocents got injured in what was a perfectly legal duel. Self-responsibility was the order of the day, which was either a blessing or a curse to the people. Common law ruled the land. Treat others the way you want to be treated, the real golden rule. Now, under common law, all interactions with your fellow man were and are some form of contract and consent. There were fewer layers of law in existence before the merging of common and marine law, and so, for example, there was no such thing as fraud, because as a sovereign who was personally responsible, at any time you could have said no. People had to be more diligent in who they dealt with, and thus, as reputation was actually considered important, people would try and honor their contracts and earn an honest living, using the court systems only for criminal prosecutions or contract disputes. Simpler times back then indeed, but also more primitive as well. Perhaps we're learning to say no again.
And if you look at the whole entire picture, the government is only your representative and representatives of your neighbors. So who are they to demand that you get a license in order to engage in an action which is fundamentally lawful?
If we don't make a stand, I mean, the reason that these guys have the power they have is because we don't say anything. It's this whole tacit agreement thing. And, you know, because we didn't stand up and make claims to stop the authorities from doing what they do, they've just sort of taken over. And so we're all running scared because we don't realize that all we have to do is say no.
You need to understand there's legal and lawful, and there's illegal and unlawful. Legal means you are operating correctly by the form or by the letter of the law. Lawfully tends to speak to the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law.
If people really understood what's going on, we're too used to the rights we've had. It wouldn't be tolerated if people really truly understood what was going on. there would be a major political reaction, and the people that are in power right now would not be there. And they don't want to take the chance. And that's what people have to understand, that there still is this vestige of democracy here, and we still should be exercising it before the police state apparatus descends, that doesn't really and truly removes from us the capacity to take control of our destiny.
The Founding Fathers of the United States desired people to have the right to life, liberty, and property, along with the free will to enjoy them and the responsibility to respect the rights of others. After fighting their revolution for freedom from colonialism, the founders were intelligent enough to retain a healthy fear of the similar threats posed by corporate power and wisely limited corporations exclusively to a business role. In the United States of America, up until around the mid to late 1800s, in order to create a company or corporation, you would have to go through the arduous process of earning a charter from a particular state, which was both limited in duration and function, needing to be renewed, but also subject to rules, regulations, and heavy taxes. They were also mandated to serve the public interest, with profit being the result to shareholders who were part of the public. If they exceeded their authority, went against their charter, or went against the public interest, a corporation's charter could be revoked, rendering it invalid, and essentially destroying it in the legal sense. The concept of corporate personhood came about around this time, which quickly gained popularity with business leaders. Discussed and dissected at length in the brilliant film The Corporation, corporate personhood is the act of giving a company, which is a legal corporation or entity, the privileges of a regular human person, such as the ability to own property, hold assets, contribute to politics, or influence legislation. With this change in the law, the corporation had gained legal status, along with rights and duties, becoming an artificial person.
A sovereign individual is a human who is no longer a corporation, thus no longer being ascribed by certain duties and rights.
What I uncovered was that when a person is registered from birth, it's at that point in time that they are actually being created, or that a legal person is being created and associated with them. And it's kind of like, it's at that point where you join a club, and when you join this club, you're given, say, a membership card. The card itself would be your person, as opposed to the human being who is the member of the club.
Person is, even in English, person is a persona. So it's not really you, it's something that you're creating. So, you know, from English to law, it means the same thing. It's an entity, it's something that you create, or somebody else creates, and you give power to. Because we're all equal, nobody has a right to govern you without your consent. So they require evidence that you have consented to this. The person is that evidence, that card, or the say your identification, which would identify you as a person. All of this is what they need to see so that they know that they do have the right to act upon you.
After the U.S. Civil War in 1868, a corporation was created by members of the Bank of England called United States Company. The owners of this company decided that the employees of the United States would not be called employees, but citizens. To run this corporation would be a board of directors called the United States Government, and they would have a president just like any company. It would also have a constitution, just like the Republic called America. And people who signed up to be employee citizens would be given political and legal rights, like voting and owning land.
I think they did it when they got everyone to become a government employee. And then that's this way, where normally they would be our servants and we would be in charge of them. They tricked us all into getting social insurance numbers. These numbers identify us as a government employee. We're receiving benefits, as they call them, and therefore we are bound by the rules that bind all government employees. And so they've tricked us. We're a nation of people employed by the government, bound by the rules that the government makes, but only because we are employed by them.
However, there is a grand distinction between the United States Corporation, which is a company, and the United States of America, which is the geographical location and country. Today we live in a world where we are sold on the notion that our fundamental rights still exist. But there are times when we must wonder if this is true. For example, we can have the full force of the law brought down upon us over a traffic violation, income tax irregularity, refusing to fill in a census form, even growing or using natural substances. These offenses do no harm to another human being and in no way violate any individual's fundamental rights and freedoms. So we must ask, how did things get like this? The answer is that your fundamental rights and freedoms are still intact as a natural person, but you've been tricked into believing that you have to follow the laws created for the corporate artificial persons. This deception has only grown over the last 140 years. Some argue this period in history was the seed of what has grown into today's expansive modern legal system. Others believe that this was the beginning of the end for the great experiment known as the Republic of the United States of America. As a human being, you have guaranteed unalienable human rights. By virtue of existing and being what is known as a child of God, whatever religion you may or may not subscribe to, your rights come from the concept that you're a result of divine creation. This is supported by documents throughout history like the Magna Carta, UN Declaration of Human Rights, various constitutions, bills of rights, and charters of rights and freedoms of different countries. Unalienable or unalienable rights, as in, no one can place a lien on your rights. They are yours to use freely.
The most fundamental thing that I've learned through all this is that they speak English, but it's a whole other language coming out of their mouth. And hence lawyers spending 8 years or whatever it takes to become a lawyer. They're trying to go and understand what the words and how this thing works.
If you try and speak to them in English or any other language, they won't be able to engage with you. You need to use their documents. And the reason why you need to use their documents is because you are within their corporation.
Well, they certainly don't teach you about what the law is about. A lot of times there seems to be a more of a societal or a community conditioning where people that at 16 they go and they get their driver's license and it's a big deal for them, and yet they never ask themselves first, do I really need a driver's license in order to exercise rights? They get a social insurance number because they want to work legally in Canada, but yet they never study and understand the difference between, say, a contract for service and a contract for hire. So they're, to a large degree, they don't really teach much. It's almost more of a conditioning program that conditions you to believe certain falsehoods.
If you don't know your rights, you don't have any. And if you have to ask someone else what your rights are, you've just given them the power to tell you what your rights are. Boiling the frog, or tiptoe totalitarianism. Oh, but how to get rid of these unalienable human rights that stand in the way of a monopolistic, elitist oligarchy of complete and utter tyranny? If you're seeking to instill total control in a society, then the only way to achieve that is to dumb down an educated populace, making them forget about their rights, or even better, to not even care about them. Of course, you cannot take away all the rights of a person in one fell swoop, but must instead boil the frog. Huh? Try putting a frog in already boiling water. Watch it jump out instantly because it can't stand the heat. The only way to boil a frog is to place it in lukewarm water in your pot on the stove and slowly turn up the heat. The frog will stay comfortable, not noticing the gradual increase in temperature, and will stay into the pot even until it boils to death. This is the way that our freedoms and our rights are being suppressed and outlawed, one at a time, little by little. Tiptoe totalitarianism. If we don't notice it happening, it can't be happening. Some of the most sinister elements of this grand deception pass by so slowly and are so interwoven into the fabric of our system that some people just cannot accept that these elements might have actually been designed to enslave us.
Because we do not know the true meaning of the occult in relation to law and religion, it is very difficult for the typical person, typical educated person, to understand how everything intercorrelates.
I think it's less about plugging into the system than it is about having an easy existence where you don't have to think and take responsibility so much. You're just going along with the herd, and it's easier to do. But it then allows them to claim the right to, half your money, half your life, essentially.
The heart of the grand deception, keeping us mired in the world of money, is keeping from us all the fact that almost every country operates with the artificial and natural person merged together as one. That means humans are being given the rights of corporations, i.e., no human rights, and artificial corporate persons are being given the rights and privileges of natural persons, more and more so. And the ones aware of this are profiting from it in a multitude of ways. The main schemes of control involve and depend on us being ignorant of our rights, ignorant of the contracts we're presented, and ignorant of our consent to these contracts every time we sign any form presented to us. One of the key aspects of creating a document, especially a legal one, is that you need words. Words in common use have their usual everyday dictionary definition. However, in law, words are defined to have a very precise meaning. No words in law are ever used accidentally. They were always defined either by legal dictionary, court ruling, or most commonly, within the definition section of an act or statute. Would you find it interesting to know that words can be redefined within a law or contract to give a word in the body of that law or contract a completely different definition or meaning, and that if you don't read the fine print or check the definition, you may just be surrendering your rights or property to whomever has authored that law or contract? The film Bursting Bubbles of Government Deception illustrates how many of these deceptions are perpetuated by our ignorance. Breaking the government down into people who use words on pieces of paper to make other people do things, the film discusses some of the etymology and definitions of important words in the legal system.
Well, application and registration and submission are pretty much the three words that they use along with the word must to get all their authority over you. The word application means to beg. And it is assumed that he who begs knows exactly what he's begging for. They know what they're receiving. They have acknowledged the authority to grant, and if it doesn't exist, they're willing to create it by transference, and they're doing it entirely voluntarily. No one can ever be bound to beg. The word submission again implies a voluntary action because it means to agree to bend to another's will, and the agreement in itself must be voluntary, or to abandon to someone else's discretion, or to leave to someone else's discretion, and that's a form of abandonment, and again, that has to be a voluntary choice. And the other one, registration, historically, was the act of a ship's captain, who would sign over his ship and all chattel contents to the harbor master for safekeeping. And so when you do register property with the government, essentially what you're doing is signing it over to them.
For example, you register your car with your state or province, giving them the deed of true ownership, while keeping the equitable title for yourself. Remember, the true owner, the registrar, has the deed. The legal owner, the registrant, is owner only in title. You may now enjoy and use the car, but a registered vehicle is required by law to be insured in most states and provinces, and a registered vehicle is also only legally operable by a person holding a valid driver's license. So, if only registered vehicles require licenses and insurance, does that mean unregistered vehicles are not bound by the statutes and acts that govern these things? When pressed with these questions, desiring clarification, the government often responds with form letters, non-answers, and sometimes even hostility. One thing they do not respond with is a clear answer. Business as usual, some might say. But it seems they're not happy with just the registration of our material property. It appears they own our bodies as well. In the early 1900s, Colonel Edward Mandell House had this to say in a private meeting with President Woodrow Wilson. Soon every American will be required to register their biological property in a national system designed to keep track of the people and that will operate under the ancient system of pledging. By such methodology, we can compel people to submit to our agenda, which will affect our security as a chargeback for our fiat paper currency. Every American will be forced to register or suffer being unable to work and earn a living. They will be our chattel, and we will hold their security interest over them forever by operation of the law merchant under the scheme of secured transactions. Americans, by unknowingly or unwittingly delivering the bill of ladings to us, will be rendered bankrupt and insolvent, forever to remain economic slaves through taxation, secured by their own pledges. They will be stripped of their rights and given a commercial value designed to make us a profit, and they will be none the wiser. For not one man in a million could ever figure out our plans, and if by accident one or two should figure it out, we have in our arsenal plausible deniability. After all, this is the only logical way to fund government, by floating liens and debt to the registrants in the form of benefits and privileges. This will inevitably reap to us huge profits beyond our wildest expectations, and leave every American a contributor to this fraud which we will call social insurance. Without realizing it, every American will insure us for any loss we may incur, and in this manner, every American will unknowingly be our servant, however begrudgingly. The people will become helpless and without any hope for their redemption, and we will employ the high office of the President of our dummy corporation to foment this plot against America. Huh? What this means, in as plain English as we can describe, is that American citizens, along with Canadians, Britons, French, and every other country that has a central banking system and social network, these people are registered at birth as chattel property. Chattel property is property held as collateral for something. In this case, the registered citizens are being held as chattel property to float bonds for government loans that add to the national debt. Our income tax is the only method by which the national debt is repaid, and our apparent obligation to pay this particular tax comes from being born into this debtor-creditor position. How can this be done to us if we are humans with unalienable rights? Simple. No one has ever made you do anything. We do it to ourselves. Now wait a second. What I mean is that every time we consent to submitting an application for registration, we are giving up a huge amount of rights in return for supposed benefits. Now, upon further research, you'll find that the concept of the corporate person has been reversed, and we are now being treated as the corporations, as non-living persons with no emotions, no rights, and no humanity. No longer are we actually persons. The concept of natural and artificial person is connected now through a joinder when we interact with any agency residing in the Admiralty Marine Law jurisdiction. How it works is like this. You're considered Admiralty Law chattel product, which is delivered by a doctor who issues a certificate of live birth for the product. Because from the banker's point of view, each birth, each product, has a dollar value. Your parents are told that it is the law to register your birth with the government. When they do this, they are abandoning their baby under Admiralty law whereby the government then picks you up as a maritime salvage and creates a company, a strawman corporation, or a fictional entity that has the exact same name as the baby, only spelled in all capital letters. This company is your artificial person. When you interact with police, government, and agencies, by using the name of your company, thinking you're using your own given name, you unknowingly give up your human rights by creating a joinder between yourself and the corporation. You are volunteering to say, I am not acting as a human, I am acting as a corporation. You aren't a person.
You have a person.
Later on in life, when you apply with any corporation, including the government, to get a license, file taxes, get a mortgage, open an account, or even vote, it is not you, the human being, who is being given these things, or the human plugging into these things. But in fact, it's your corporate strawman acting on your behalf. New entities are being created with different titles depending on the version of the corporate strawman that's being used. For instance, your person that is licensed to drive, as defined by the legal system, is a driver. Someone who creates a bank account has created a company called a customer. A voter who registers to vote in any election has created a company called a voter. And anyone who applies for Social Security or social insurance, or ever files a tax return, has created a corporate entity with the same name as him or herself, only in all capital letters, and this corporate person is called a taxpayer. As Edward Mandell House said, the elites would make it hard, if not impossible, to work legally and thus earn a living unless people registered their biological property and submitted to the social insurance scheme. The number given to citizens as a social insurance number or a social security number is used to track where you work, how much you earn, and how many benefits you've earned. How sad that we would give up so many freedoms in return for a few paltry benefits. Of course, the system was not designed to last or to support ever-growing numbers of people who would need support. Ask anyone on a pension if it's what they've expected. Or sincerely question whether your retirement savings are actually going to be there when you retire. At any time, the banks can just close you off from your money, and since they own the Senate, the House, the judges, the lawyers, and the policymakers, good luck with your recourse. Slavery is the legal fiction that a person is property. Corporate personhood is the legal fiction that property is a person. American patriot Aaron Russo, who passed away earlier this year, created a brilliant film called America, Freedom to Fascism, which really explored the origins of the income tax in the United States, even interviewing Sheldon Cohen, the old IRS commissioner and a contributor to the IRS tax code. The premise of the film is that there is no actual law that exists that requires the average American citizen to pay tax on his labor or wages, citing Supreme Court cases where income was defined as capital gains or profits arising from corporate activities.
So I called Sheldon Cohen because he used to be the IRS commissioner, he wrote the tax code, and he was also general counsel to the IRS. He is a true expert, and I couldn't find a better person to answer my questions. So can the government criminally prosecute somebody of information put on their 1040?
Yes.
Right, so doesn't that violate the Fifth Amendment?
No.
But the Fifth Amendment says I don't have to do anything that incriminates myself.
Well, it doesn't incriminate you to put your income down.
But you said before I could be put in jail for it.
Title 26 requires you to file a return.
But doesn't Title 26 have to be in compliance with the Supreme Court decisions?
You're going to take a 1920 case and superimpose it on the whole Internal Revenue Code that was written after it? No, that's not.
I can't believe what I just heard. Rewind.
You're going to take a 1920 case and superimpose it on the whole Internal Revenue Code that was written after it? No, that's not.
Remember he said earlier the Internal Revenue Code was authorized by the 16th Amendment?
The Internal Revenue Code is authorized by the 16th Amendment.
Remember, the Supreme Court said the 16th Amendment did not give the government any new taxing power. These decisions have never been overturned. Let's listen further. Can the lower courts overrule the Supreme Court?
No.
How are they putting people in jail today for not paying a tax on their labor when the Supreme Court said they don't have to? Doesn't the IRS code have to be in compliance with the Supreme Court? That's my
Aaron,
question.
this is a waste of time.
Well,
Because whatever I say, you're not going to believe.
He's right. I don't believe him. And neither should you. He wants us to believe we should obey the IRS code, which is being enforced in violation of the many Supreme Court decisions. If
No,
the
no,
Supreme
no.
Court made a decision...
Thank you, Aaron. I think we're finished.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cohen, you're doing that.
Well, I'm sorry that you constantly re-argue the point. You're liable because the law says that you're liable,
But
and the courts say the law says you're liable,
Doesn't-
and that's why you're liable.
You see, he's talking about the lower courts, who are not in compliance with the Supreme Court, as they have to be. Doesn't the court have to be in compliance with the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court has so held.
Where?
You caught me unprepared.
I'll come back.
I don't want to do that.
But let me ask you a hypothetical question.
No. You're making silly arguments.
Why is the Supreme Court decision a silly argument?
Well, because it's inapplicable.
That made my heart stop. He just said Supreme Court decisions do not apply to the IRS. That's the behavior you would expect from a totalitarian country, maybe China or Russia or Cuba. Not from America. They're just making up the law as they go along. Now I knew the tax honesty movement was right. The IRS thrives on intimidation and fear, not by law. It's no different than a criminal protection racket, using force to extract your money from you. Then the former IRS commissioner, now working at a prestigious Washington law firm, threatens me. Watch.
Aaron, you understand Yiddish. Cornish to helfen.
For those of you who don't understand Yiddish, that means nothing will help you.
We are still a slave to the money. And that means every man, woman, and child who pays income tax is a slave.
Thus, the argument of the film is that the income tax is unconstitutional, which it very well may be, especially if the 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was never properly ratified. However, claims that income tax is illegal may be wrong when you realize that the system depends on all human beings signing up to act as taxpayer corporations and thereby accept tax liabilities. The law is purposely complicated to thwart investigation by the layman and protect the integrity of a system that is built upon quicksand. Canada is in the same boat, where the country's income tax is a 2,000-plus page monstrosity, complicated to the point of causing an aneurysm. Both the United States and Canadian law, and probably a lot of other countries as well, specify in their income tax laws that all government employees are income taxable in order to help pay for government. That is why you must pay. As a citizen, you are a government employee. The main deception comes from layering the law that allows collecting of regular corporate income tax from actual companies and then applying that law to collect tax from the citizen who's ignorant of his or her employee status.
Maybe it's just a way to keep us in a climate of fear and keep our minds off the fact that central bankers run everything, run the mass media, run the education system, and we are not really free. We are free in that people like you and I can say what we want, but we will never get heard beyond a limited audience. We'll never get paid for doing what we're doing. I'm not paid, you're not paid.
Why do you think you've been able to get away with not paying or filing your income taxes for so long?
Well, first of all, I've not gotten away with anything. I'm not hiding from anyone. I'm simply asking the IRS to show me the laws that apparently require me to do these things, and they are suspiciously reticent to answer questions from me, and of course there are millions of other people, many other organizations who have attempted to get answers. They act very suspiciously when asked to simply sit down at the table with the American people and discuss what their obligations are. Rather than pulling up a chair, they pull out a club.
because our country's bankrupt. And if you don't believe me, why do we have a receiver general? If we're in receivership, our country's in receivership. So what they do is they take all our income tax money, every dime of it, forward it to the United Nations. The United Nations forwards it to the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and then they will back our ability to work against Canada's ability to pay through our labours, because they get it first. And then they go to the Bank of Canada and say, okay, Canada can borrow money again. And they track all this by our SIN number, birth certificate number, and we also have a bond number.
At the same time, many of the most wealthy and well-known corporate brand companies set up shell and holding companies in countries with tax shelters and hold billions in assets, avoiding the legal corporate income tax in a maze of hierarchical company ownerships and stock percentage manipulations. Some licensed citizens even change their residency to other low-tax countries and then just live as a human in the United States or Canada, making millions, if not billions, of dollars of low-tax or tax-free money running their business through this country. The argument for abolishing the income tax makes sense when you consider the following. The income tax provides for not one service in government. Not one wage, school, road, hospital, salary, or program is paid for by the income tax. The roads are paid for by gas taxes. Education is paid for by property taxes. The military is paid for by legal corporate income tax. Hospitals and healthcare are paid for by lotteries and excise taxes on alcohol and cigarettes. City infrastructure is paid for by violation tickets, fines, and fees. The goods and service tax, along with provincial and state taxes, pay for the majority of other services we enjoy. And so they should, as they are mandatory taxes applied to almost everything we buy. Income tax, however, applies only to paying the interest on the national debt, nothing else. The debt never goes down, and some people wonder why income tax feels like perpetual slavery. It literally is. Think about it. Money not paid to the government as income tax, where it subsequently goes to private bankers as profit, will inevitably be spent on some sort of good or service that will still be taxed. So it's not as if removing income tax, allowing us all to earn and keep more money, and abolishing the national debt would wreck our nations. If anything, they could become prosperous once more. However, if we like the concept of half the wealth being owned by less than 1% of the population, I guess we'll just have to keep things the way they are. Thankfully, there are groups who are not only trying to educate people of these legal shenanigans, but are actively in court themselves, advocating, defending, and letter writing. Around the world today, many activist groups have been popping up. A lot of these have been focusing specifically on the freedom movement, such as Canada's Think Free organization, and also the Elizabeth Ann Elaine Society, who are advocating going back to sovereignty status, firing the government, and becoming what is recognized as a free man on the land, a designation whereby an individual is recognized no longer as a person in law or a natural person, but a free human living on land, not bound by any act or statute, nor any governing body or corporate entity. Robert Arthur Menard explains how he went through the process.
In my research, I found that people used to use notices of understanding and intent and claims of right all the time. If there was a conflict, if they wanted to avoid conflict or ensure that if there was a conflict, they came out on top, they would serve what was called a notice of understanding and intent and then a claim of right. You do that now with the government. You create a document that expresses your understanding, expresses your intent, what your actions are, and then you claim the right to do that. You go through the notarial process and you serve notice to them and you give them a chance to dispute. If they don't dispute, then the notary crafts a document saying they were served, they had a chance to dispute. They didn't, he wins. So it's a very simple process. It's as easy as saying to the host of the house, hey buddy, it's time for me to leave, I'm leaving, have a good day.
totally eliminate the corporate rule and get back to rule by the people who are prepared to change our system so that there's an accountability that goes right back to the people, where people can even recall their MPs if they don't do as they promised to do, and a whole restructuring of the apparatus of government, the officials and the bureaucrats who work in there, who right now are accountable and serve the interests of the corporate elite rather than the interests of the people of Canada. Not the government of Canada, but the people of Canada. We go back to requiring them to take an oath of allegiance to serve the common good of the and to do their public duty. Those are things that can be done and should be done. And so it's a question of getting back in and taking control and reasserting ourselves. It can be done.
There's many solutions in commerce. There's many movies that offer even much better solutions than that. But the bottom line is we got to stop printing money and debt, because what's it cost to print a piece of paper?
Now, though there are no silver bullets to defeating an entity as large as the governing corporate system, knowing your human rights and being aware of the mechanisms through which others try and control you can help prevent your consent from being obtained due to ignorance. It's a good idea to always question when somebody wants you to sign something. You never know when it may come back to bite you in the ass.
Using money and commerce law as a 1-2 punch against the vast majority of us who lack understanding due to our ignorance is a practice that has existed for centuries. As our collective human capacity for intelligence and understanding increases, so too does the complexity of both the monetary system and the legal system. It is now at the point where, inside a court, the judge will claim the power to render irrelevant any and all arguments put forth by any person choosing to appear in court. We are operating under a de facto system. However, there are those who are taking the time to do their homework and research how to speak back in this foreign legalese language. The results have been mixed, but incredibly interesting to say the least. The important thing to remember is that these are supposed to be our servants, and they have just tricked us into thinking we work for them. We must remember who we are and who we are not whenever we interact with any facet of the system, because if enough of us collectively remember and educate, then the system changes with that expansion of awareness. We, the people, have the power to effect mass positive change, but we must communicate and take the time to understand and become aware of what is really going on around us. We have been conditioned to fear going to court, fear encounters with any officer or any agency of the government, to fear what this person might do, or fear what the planet might do. We even fear letters that we receive in the mail. We cannot live this way anymore, because we are being bullied into a permanent control system. It appears that law is one area where these controlling elites are especially vulnerable to an educated public. It could be the avenue where we the people truly regain our human rights and freedoms. Be sure to visit thecauseofeffect.com to watch free videos about income tax and court victories, as there are actually many successes, but they get no mainstream media coverage. These free videos are not easy to find otherwise, as the elites want you to feel you have no chance of winning, and that they have a 100% successful conviction rate against tax protesters. Both of their claims are patently false.